particularly interested to hear these speakers because they're very prominent in the disability sector, and the National Disability Insurance Scheme is very new, and I'd like to hear different people's opinions on it.
Allow me to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker will be Dr. Mark Bagshaw, and I would like to say really three things about Mark. First, he's a corporate high flyer and distinguished strategic thinker. He worked in senior management levels over 20 years with IBM. He's using his corporate experience to ensure that the world is looking after people who are facing disadvantage, and he's quite sought after consultant by both government and private enterprise. What's also is very important, he's very effective advocate for people with disabilities. Some time ago I was Disability Discrimination Commissioner, and when you got Mark into your room, he didn't leave before he achieved what he came to achieve. But he's also co-founder and chairman of a number of organizations, foundations and trusts. And third thing which I would like to say, he's certainly a very much humanitarian person, and he's simply a decent bloke. We had not that long a dinner, and we had very, very strong discussions about refugees, about other issues, and Mark certainly is concerned not only about people with disabilities, but about every human being who is suffering a disadvantage. And having this kind of CV, he is very frequent public speaker, he's on many boards, he's got many awards, including honorary doctorate from Griffith University. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mark Bagshaw.
Thanks, Sept. Let me start with my favourite party trick. I love this. Those of you at the front will see very quickly what I'm doing. You can see the chair going up. Why am I doing this? Well, firstly, because I can, to show off this very, very smart piece of technology. But I'm doing it for more than that. I want to make a very, very simple point. This disability reform space is a minefield. It is complex. There are many, many different things need to happen to give people with disabilities an equal go in our community. But some of this stuff, folks, is not rocket science. I'd been using a manual chair since I was 16 years old until about 10 years ago when I decided it was time to use a power chair. You'd think I'd know all about power chairs because I'd been using a wheelchair all my life. I knew nothing about them. You wouldn't believe how much variety there is in power wheelchairs out there. I tried almost every chair there was on the market at the time and finally settled on this chair because it had a number of features that were particularly attractive. This feature that I'm showing you here now was not the one I thought I'd be most enamored with. This is just amazing. The first time they brought this chair over to me, it was a demo chair. It was the first in the country that could do this sort of thing. I got into the chair and of course played with all the buttons, including this one. And I just cannot tell you how profound the feeling was for the first time in my adult life to be able to see the room from this perspective. I hadn't seen it since I was 16 years old. I wasn't expecting the profound emotional effect that it had on me. That night, I went up to the pub for the first time, legally, being in a pub. I sat at the bar. In the past, I'd never been able to sit at a bar because the bars are always high and I'm low. That weekend, I went to the art gallery. I love the art gallery, but I always used to come out with a sore neck because all the paintings are mounted at standing height, not sitting height. So for the first time, the chair moves around, as you can see. So I moved around the art gallery just like this. I go to lots of cocktail parties. For the first time, I've been able to participate at a cocktail party. Previously, I couldn't hear what was going on. I'm going to come back to this right at the end. But as complex as this is, we have got to understand the emotional impact that living with a disability has on people and all of those around them. It is, in my view, the thing that is least well understood in the disability space. The National Disability Insurance Scheme, do we need it? Well, that's a rhetorical question, isn't it? Of course we need it. We've desperately needed it in this country for 50 years, if not longer. And people with disabilities have been screaming for it for that length of time. Why? Because it costs an enormous amount of money to live with a disability. And if I have to spend all my money and all my effort in just acquiring the basic stuff you all take for granted, then I am so far behind the 8 ball it doesn't count. Yeah, we desperately need an NDIS. But let's understand why. Why do we need a National Disability Insurance Scheme? Look at these numbers up here on this chart. Are people with disabilities participating equally in the Australian community today, or close to it? No, not on any possible measure of participation are people with disabilities, the 20% of our population who are living with a disability, on not one single measure are people with disabilities anywhere near the same level of participation as the average Australian population. Let's take a look at this first chart that's looking just at education levels. So that's the general population. You can see a lot, most people go through Year 12, less through the vocational education and training system, and some through degrees. Now, if people with disabilities were participating equally in education, these are percentage numbers, the bars would be the same for people with disabilities. No, they're not the same. They're far short in every area, far short. In fact, the scale of that doesn't really give you the true indication. Some of these areas there, people with disabilities in training are participating at only just over half the rate of the average Australian population. Let's take a look at source of income. There's where people with disabilities are getting their daily income from. Far less from wages and far more from pensions than the average population. What about participation rates in employment and the levels of unemployment? Look at these disgraceful figures. Disgraceful figures. There's a 30% difference in workforce participation for people with disabilities. And there has been ever since I first became aware of these statistics. And what's even more disturbing about these figures is that they have not changed in 50 years. They have not changed in 50 years. Look at the income levels of people with disabilities. Well, this chair, $30,000 worth of chair. And because I'm not subject to compensation, I've had to pay for it myself. Fortunately for people in my situation, through the advocacy of many people over many years, I do get some support. And in fact, for me personally, I suspect the NDIS is not going to make a huge difference because I've been empowered enough to basically, one way or the other, gather the resources I need around me. But the average person just does not get that opportunity. So there's some raw numbers, but let's put it in perspective. Anyone know what that is? The Rose Bowl in California, the largest open air stadium in the US. There are 98,000 people in that auditorium, 98,000 people. Can you see them? You can't even see them, there's so many of them. You just see the little dots. That's a lot of people. Do you know what this is? That's the number of people with disabilities of working age today, the extra people with disabilities of working age who can work and who want to work, who are sitting at home today on a disability support pension. Now, these are real people. Every one of those dots is a real person. This is disgraceful, Australia. And in fact, we're one of the worst in the Western world in all of this stuff. Putting that in economic terms, if those 606 odd thousand people with disabilities of working age who want to and could work today, If they were working, we'd be saving $12.5 billion in pensions, and the contribution they'd be making if they were working at just 10% lower than the average productivity GDP contribution of the average Australian worker, they'd be adding a further $54 billion to Australia's GDP. What's going on here? Sev, in the introduction, said that I've spent most of my professional career in the business sector, in strategic business management, strategic change management. Only a few years after I started to become actively involved in the disability reform space and the social development space, I started to apply the strategic thinking skills that I'd been developing in IBM and in business to this challenge of disability. And if we think of Australia as Australia Inc., then this is the disability division of Australia Inc., and it's 20%. It's 20% of our total business here. So I know it's the business, it's people, but let's just think of it from that point of view. If all we want to think about is just the economy for a minute, let's think about that. By the way, the 606,000, just those who'd be working today, there's an extra $120,000 who'd be in the training system, and another 110,000 who'd be in the university sector. Why are they all sitting at home today, not doing anything? What's going on? In my view, there are three interrelated things that are dragging the vast majority of people with disabilities down. The first of those three things are the massive infrastructure barriers. Well, most people don't take too long to get that one. If I sit and say, you know, do you reckon you'd be as productive as you are now if you could only catch 1 in 10 buses? People say, no, that would make things a bit difficult, wouldn't it? If you couldn't get into buildings, if you were blind and someone came into a meeting and said, sorry folks, just been at the photocopier, can you all take a read of this document? We're all going to have a comment, I'll give you 5 minutes to read it. And nobody's thought there's a blind person there, how's that person going to read the document? Do you think that would make life hard? Yes, it makes life damn hard. And the core issue here is that we have spent inestimable trillions of dollars building this society that we all enjoy, but we haven't designed that society with the needs of people with disabilities taken into account. Why is it okay that a person without a disability can catch buses, but people with disabilities can't? Why is that okay?
This is a really good opportunity for me to meet different people and study like different perspectives on disability rights. So it's quite, unique and quite useful for me actually.
I think to the extent we're doing anything about disability, and we are, of course, we've been trying to do stuff about this for years. I'll come to the way we've been approaching this towards the end, but it's not just the infrastructure barriers, as significant as they are. The second thing are the community expectations, and that starts often with people with disabilities themselves. Yesterday I was truly aspirational about my life, but today I have a disability because I was injured or something. And now my aspirations have gone through the floor. And so have mum and dad's, and so have the next door neighbours, and so the general community, so is the employer. Nobody's expecting me to make the same contribution that they did yesterday. Why? Because, poor Mark's got a disability and he can't contribute? Rubbish. Rubbish. I can put you on a plane now and take you all around the world, all around Australia, and introduce you to people with every type of disability and every severity of disability, and I can show you people who are not just putting tops on bottles in sheltered workshops, they are making a significant contribution to the Australian economy. This is a problem that can be solved, but the community doesn't think it can. And the third thing is, well, I'm not going to sit here and say living with a disability is easy, and that sometimes it's not hard work, and sometimes emotionally you think, if I go into one more restaurant and the waiter talks to my wife and not me, I'll scream. Yes, emotionally, it is really hard work living with a disability. Now, I'm not going to tell you that it's great, but for many people with disabilities, all this stuff is just completely overwhelming. Their life's gone from a level of complication at a level 2, out of 10 being the most complicated, It's gone up to a level 10 or 11. And people just feel overwhelmed. So it's easier to stay at home. But it's not just the three things together, it's all of those things linked up together. Why are we not removing the infrastructure barriers? Because nobody expects people with disabilities to use a bus anyway, so why bother? But why is the next door neighbour not expecting Mark to go to work? Oh, because I saw him at the bus stop the other day and 3 buses came and they weren't accessible. So what, you think that means you should just come and put a rug over my lap? Why don't you pick up the phone, next door neighbour, and ring up the Transport Minister and say you don't get my vote next time unless you make those buses accessible? And these two things together, they're the key reasons why George or Mary are feeling completely disempowered. Because it is damn hard work out there in the community, just doing day-to-day things, and nobody's expecting me, everybody's treating me now like a second or third class citizen. So that's massively disempowering for people. But of course the bus owner, when I say make your buses accessible, says, oh, I feel sorry for people with disabilities, but they're all sitting around feeling sorry for themselves. Yeah, but partly because you haven't made your buses accessible, pal. So, what does life look like for the average person? I reckon this is what life is like. In our modern world, the average person, and privileged people in particular, are living life on a superhighway. You know, life's pretty damn good for the average person, particularly in a country like Australia. People are moving around quickly, safely, fast. They're living great lives. And, of course, not only just a straight superhighway, there's plenty of choice there. So we've built that into the superhighway. You can go off in different directions if you want. And, of course, not only the superhighway is life, if you like, the world we live in, but most of us have built around us a vehicle to travel through the superhighway of life. Now, some of us, that vehicle's a small, slow car, some it's a medium car, some's a fast car. So some people are travelling in the fast lane, some in the slow lane, but the average person's on the superhighway of life. What about people with disabilities? We're travelling on the superhighway of life? Absolutely not. We're travelling on the back roads of life. This is what life with a disability looks like. Life with a disability is travelling on the back roads, on the dirt roads, coming to broken bridges, flooded highways. That's what living a life with a disability is like. And on top of that, we're travelling in a horse and cart. What's disability reform all about with this analogy? Disability reform is about building on-ramps all the way along the old road, pointing people onto the superhighway. That's the first thing we have to do. Some people are a fair way down that track towards full participation. You know, people with disabilities nearly completed their university education, for example. But we need an on-ramp, a quick on-ramp to get the person into a job. At the other end of the spectrum, somebody's living in a group home or a nursing home. The on-ramp needs to be right at the beginning of the journey to get the person into independent living and so on. But there's on-ramps all the way along the superhighway, off the back roads. Don't fix up the back roads, guys. Let the back roads just fall apart. But get me onto the superhighway, but not in the horse and cart. If you put me in the horse and cart, I'll get up onto the superhighway and the first truck that comes along will blow me to smithereens. So not only do I need on-ramps, so that's getting into society, I need to be equipped with all that I need to be a strong and participatory ready individual. That includes having all the tools I need, but it also includes the emotional strength to be able to live life. I reckon we can predict the life outcome of any individual with this simple formula, the X factor. If I look at you guys and say, let me take a quick run around the room. Anybody around here, I'll predict your life outcome, whether you'll lead a privileged life, an average life, or a disadvantaged life. I can predict that if I could measure 3 factors. Your X factor, what you're born with, your motivation levels, your intelligence, they're all great. Secondly, I would measure your Y factor. Yes, you're born with lots of X factor, but if you learnt to use it, I reckon there's a lot of people in the jail system who were born with lots of X factor, who are living a very disadvantaged life because they've never learnt the basic skills to take control of their lives. So they've got low Y factor. And then the third factor is the Z factor. If I could measure the world that you live in, I mean, we're all already on a good start with that one. Australia's a great world to live in. But for you, the world's been built around you. So you've got a great transport system and you've got great access and you've got great access to everything, basically. And it's those three things together. If I could add them up, maybe 10, if you had 30 units in total, that makes you average. 40 units makes you privileged and 20 units makes you underprivileged. If you've got 10 plus 10 plus 10, then you'll be average. And here's how this works. Okay, let's take a look. Let's take the average person. Is the average person going to lead an average life? Well, yeah, probably. And the way they're going to live an average life could well be because they've got average X factor, average Y factor, and average Z factor. Gives them an average life. But hang on, we're all different. What if I've got no Z factor? What if I'm born into a war-torn country? Low Z factor, but if I've got really good motivation and I've had great life experience to develop my capacity, then maybe I'll still lead an average life. On the other end of the spectrum, what if I've got very low Y factor? I've never really had great opportunities to develop my life skills, but I'm living in an absolutely superb environment. You know, maybe brilliant family in a rich area of Sydney, etc. But all three of those fictitious scenarios could lead to average. What about privileged? Well, you know, more than average X factor, more than average Y factor, more than average Z factor can make you privileged, but so can extremely high X factor, but not as much Z factor. Maybe the world's not that great. Maybe you're living in an environment, a remote area of Australia or something. So your Z factor's not as good, but you can still lead a privileged life. Now here are the silver spooners. These are the ones who were born on the North Shore of Sydney in a very wealthy family where daddies put them through university. They had no X factor at all, very low X factor, but they've still ended up privileged. And then I think you got the message here. What about disadvantaged person? Let's take the average person, so a person with a disability. They're just average X factor. Okay, so put the average X factor up there, but they've never learnt the really intense life skills they need. Yeah, it's not good enough just to have average planning skills anymore because life's become so complicated. So I haven't learnt to use my X factor, and of course for anybody with a disability is dealing with low Z factor. So I'm going to be disadvantaged, or will I be disadvantaged? Let's think about this same X factor, but what if we get in and teach people core life skills so they can take control of their lives? Good Y factor, and let's get these buses accessible and make more access. What if we go even further? You've got an even better dose of X factor. What I'm saying here is you can actually live a very privileged life with a disability, and I think I'm one of many who do.
It's really important that I can tell other people. I go back to the office and tell the other staff as well, just to have a better understanding of what the scheme will be, and be able to tell the people that I work with, the parents and the carers, what it's all about as well, in an informed way.
Okay, the whole of life approach. Let's take a look at, that's just the problem analysis. So I've now given some thought to how do we address these three things. The first thing we do, removing the infrastructure barriers. Well, the key thing here is to get the business sector engaged. Why? Because the business sector owns, or if it doesn't own, it basically builds most of the infrastructure. And I don't mean just physical infrastructure, I mean the entire infrastructure of our community, including our legal systems and our health systems, private sector builds, hospitals, etc. And how do we get the business sector engaged? Well, firstly, we show them that there's a massive business opportunity. Secondly, we insist that they understand the notion of universal design. Don't build a bus that's not accessible and then spend $1 million making it accessible. Just go back to the factory and design it accessible. And then thirdly, let's really invoke this licence to operate. We've got a Disability Discrimination Act. Let's give it some teeth. Let's get out there and force people to do the right thing if they won't do it. Just like you've got to meet occupational health safety standards as a business, you've also got to provide your service to everybody who wants it on an equal basis, or you don't operate in our society. How do we change community perceptions? Well, this is the simplest of the lot. The only difference between selling computers or cars and selling the capability of people with disabilities, and that's the product we need to sell, the capacity and potential of people with disabilities, the only difference is that, in fact, you use the same techniques, but you've got to have quality images of people with disabilities in front of everybody, the entire population, every day and every night for 3 years minimum. So the only thing we need there is a lot of money. Government, if you put one more time $10 million on the table for a national marketing strategy, I will shove it down your throat. $10 million is not enough to do the job. And then finally, can you build people's individual capacity? Or is this just all about X factor? Absolutely not. We can, but we have got to start from scratch and teach people the basic skills they need to take control of their lives. So the capacity building's in two areas. Make sure people have got the wheelchairs they need. So that's all the disability support, and someone to get them out of bed, and someone as a sign language interpreter, make sure that. But also, integrated lifelong learning is, to me, the key to all of this. And then, of course, we need to make a social investment. I'm going to just very quickly cover each one of these three things in a little bit more detail. Engaging the business sector, Mark, that 20% of the population, that's a lot of people, isn't it? But look, what's the point? They're not going to buy anything, they haven't got any money anyway, rubbish. We've proven over and over and over again till we're blue in the face that people with disabilities, yes, they don't have as much money as the average, on average, but people with disabilities have got a lot more money to spend than you think, and there are the numbers. I've been doing some work recently in the airline industry, and this is a chart that I've been using to talk about the opportunities in the travel industry. Look at this, really robust statistics about the amount of money being spent by Australians with disabilities in the travel industry. What, 11% of the total money being spent in Australia on travel is being spent by people with disabilities? Like, it should be 20%, of course, because 20% of people, but even 11% is a huge part of the market. $4.8 billion per annum. What about people with disabilities and employees? Oh yeah, we'll find a couple of jobs, and we'll sit you behind the desk and maybe you can collate the photocopying. But hang on, I've got a further degree, a honours degree. Oh yeah, but you've got a disability. Oh, rubbish. Look at this. You don't need to read this chart. It doesn't really matter. What you do need to look at, though, is this next bit. These are really robust, hard-nosed business surveys around the world of people with disabilities as employees. And look at this. On every measure that an employer uses to judge whether a person with a disability is a good employee, people with disabilities come up at least as good, if not better, than the average employee. What have we got to do here, folks, with this? I'm now on to the community expectations. There's the bar for you guys. People expect you to jump a fairly high bar, don't they? You know, you're pretty capable, you're intelligent, and we expect big things from you. Is the bar as high for a person with a disability? No, of course it's not as high. That's where the bar is for a person with a disability. You think, oh, poor Mark, he can't do as much as everybody else. Rubbish. But that's where the community thinks the bar is. Of course, exactly the same thing applies to Indigenous people and others. You know, it's exactly the same model. The bar is lower. But, you know, what about the compounding effect? If you're Indigenous with a disability, nobody expects anything from you. Okay, let's take a look at this Y factor. This is the lifelong learning pathway. What's happening here, I think, is that, while we've been trying to get people with disabilities into mainstream education, we've ignored the fact that many people with disabilities have never developed the more intense life skills they need to be part of the community. This is a life learning model that I think applies to all of us. Very simple model. I think there are three different types of skills that we all need to participate in society. We need personal skills. You can see some of them up there, you know, literacy and numeracy and various other sorts of skills. Some of them formal, some of them very informal. You know, personal planning skills, health management skills. They're all personal skills that make you a functional person. ready to face the world. Then there's a group of skills I call world skills. They're about us learning how to connect with society. What's my place in society? How does society work? So it's all about communication, understanding human diversity, all that sort of stuff. When you've learnt your world skills, you're now a connected person. That then takes you on to it's not quite linear, of course. You don't learn all these things in exactly this way. But the third set of skills that we do put a lot of focus on are the vocational skills, in the broadest sense of vocational. The skills that make us a productive person. But for you, those first two boxes just sort of happen, don't they? But for people with disabilities, they don't just happen. We need a program that develops life learning pathways for people with disabilities. You've all seen Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I've always thought there was a lot of sense in poor old Abraham Maslow's theory here. But it's a very simple theory. You know, if you don't get your basic food and stuff, you can't do the next thing, looking at security, etc. Now, of course, full participation in society, really, particularly in a modern society, really only comes when you're reasonably high up that hierarchy. Now, for the average person, for all of us, I reckon the lifelong learning pathway is our ladder up Maslow's hierarchy. So we all climb that ladder. We start at the beginning to get our lives in order, and then we move up further and further, and we finally get jobs, and we finally get, some of us at least, to self-actualisation. But what's happened for people with disabilities, someone come along with a truck, sometimes literally, and has knocked the ladder over, and I've fallen back to the ground. So I need a lifelong learning pathway that takes me back in there. Okay, so the NDIS. Do we need this NDIS? Look, of course we need the NDIS. But for more than just the money. Where does the NDIS fit in this model? If my model of disability is true, then where does the NDIS fit? Is it all of it? Is the solution to all of it? No, it's not. That's where the NDIS fits in my view. The NDIS's primary role is in building the capacities of individuals with the tools and the support they need, and I think it has a role in the life learning thing, but it also has a role to develop a disability market out there. Not much point having the willingness and the confidence now to go out and live independently if I can't find a carer to work for me. So there's a market aspect of it, and there's definitely a major communications aspect, but it's not the total solution. What is the NDIS? I mean, people have said to me, what is this thing called the NDIS? I know there's a lot of money around it. Yeah, that's the first part of the NDIS. The NDIS represents now more than double what's being spent on disability services in Australia. So that is the thing most people talk about. But to me, the two even more important things are firstly that the scheme's universal. It applies to everybody with a disability, not how you got your... Like I didn't get any compensation at all, not that I'm complaining about that personally, but I didn't get any compensation, but if I'd been injured in a car accident, I would have been looked after for life. I mean, how does that make any sense? And then finally, it's giving people choice and control. Now this is the real Achilles heel, potentially the NDIS. It's all right for us to be saying, look, in addition to putting the money in, we're going to give you, people with disabilities, more choice over what you purchase and what services you use and when you use them. But what if I haven't developed the basic life skills, for example, to manage a small team of carers? It's all right to say, here, you can manage that yourself, but have I got the skills to be able to do that? And to me, this is the absolute core issue with disability services. I've just listed a whole range of, what you call them, programs, whatever you want to call them, all the things that are going on out there and have been for years in the disability space, and that's probably only about 20 of them. I probably could make that chart enormous. The problem I think we've got with disability services overall is that this is how their eyes, by the way, I couldn't find a symbol that looked really like an eye. They're supposed to be eyes looking downwards on each of those things. I think this is a massive issue, that all of the programs in this disability space, or the vast majority of them, are all managed from a single program level. But it seems nobody ever talks to each other. The superhighway of life, how are we going to create a superhighway between Sydney and Melbourne if the bit between Goulburn and, I don't know, Wagga or something has a completely different surface, or a fast train, if over the border we change the gauge of the railway. So what I think we need to be doing with disability services is to stop thinking about disability services from this program perspective, a vertical silo perspective, and look at it through the eyes of the person with a disability, to understand what's the totality of stuff you need, George, to get back on the rails. I come back to my raising wheelchair. I loved this cartoon when I first saw it. Those of you who are Dalek fans will love that chart. I must admit, when I was younger, I always thought about the Daleks and thought, how do they get up steps? Of course, they didn't in the early... Have you noticed now, though, if you're a Doctor Who fan, they've now got jet motors underneath them, so they now go up steps. But, you know, I come back to the very simple first point. Yeah, all of this is big. It's all complex. There's so much of it. We need to link all this stuff together, all of that. But in the end, guys, it's the absolute fundamental basics that will be the make or break of the future of people with disabilities in Australia. Thanks.
I've been aware of Dr. Sept's forums for a few years, and I try never to miss one because the subjects he covers are mostly very important, mostly very relevant to people, and normally not as discussed in the media as they should be.
Our second speaker is Susan Kolb, AO. Allow me to introduce her briefly because she's certainly a pioneer, and also she's one of those unsung champions who did so much for people with disabilities, especially in area of employment. She started working in this area in 1990, it was a long time ago, and then she became a general manager of high-performing disability employment service, and by now she is the founding chief executive of the Australian Network on Disability. And I attended a number of meetings and breakfast meetings and other, and I must say it's a formidable organization which consists of private businesses which are financing all this enterprise. She's got over 120 private businesses and universities or government agencies, and she's working hard to ensure that there is a job for every person with disability in Australia. For her work, she was awarded in 2010 AM on Australia Day. Please welcome Susan.
Those of us who work with people with disability and have people with disability in our lives, you know, it's kind of our hot button. But if we're going to move beyond and be able to really make a difference, our message needs to work for those people for whom are interested, but it is not of their daily life. Because it's really those people who have the greatest capacity to spread that message in a way to those who aren't currently engaged in this agenda. And so I want to give you a special welcome, and so I'm glad that you're here, and hope that you take away from this session tonight some key things for you to do. And I always try to make sure I never speak to anyone without giving them something to do, because otherwise I might have wasted their time. The topic being about, do we need a national disability insurance scheme? I just want to put that into perspective. So we need a national disability insurance scheme for all the reasons that Mark said, so that the people who have need for support can get that support and join the superhighway of life. It is a foundation, it is not enough. We have 4 million Australians with disability in Australia, and 410,000 people will benefit from the National Disability Insurance Scheme. That's about 10%. So I really want to draw your attention to the remaining 90% of people for whom the National Disability Insurance Scheme will have no impact. And to actually focus on the broader agenda, which is the umbrella, the overarching aspect of our policy in Australia, which is the National Disability Strategy. The National Disability Strategy sets out our framework across 6 areas of life up until 2020. It's a COAG document that state governments are working towards, and indeed our federal governments are working towards. So it does have a real structure and it will happen. So although we have the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which has captured the attention, and rightly so, and will hopefully provide the foundation supports for people to live contributing lives and meaningful lives, I think there are other things that need to be talked about. And the area that's close to my heart is people's economic security. Because if we don't know how we're going to cope financially, then, you know, I think it was Groucho Marx said something like, you know, the problem with being poor is it takes up all of your time. It's hard to generate opportunity if you are in poverty. It's hard to develop a genuine interest in building your skill set, or to learning, to actually acquiring skills if being poor gets in your way. And I'd like to point out that Australia, who has a proud economic achievement at the moment, when it comes to our credentials, we are 27 out of 27 for risk of poverty of people with disability. So I think we just need to kind of put this into broader perspective. We are 21 out of 27 for employment participation for people with disability. And in fact, for employment participation for people with disability, if we were just doing as well as our friends in New Zealand, we would have added $9 billion to our GDP today. And if we decide to set a goal to be as good as New Zealand, not in sport, but in employment participation of people with disability, we would add $43 billion to our GDP. So to some extent, these are the very important issues. So in order to make that, there are some key aspects that I think are some opportunities that the NDIS can leverage improvement on the National Disability Strategy. And I'm going to draw an example out of from my personal life. A few years ago, a long time ago actually, we built a house up in the Blue Mountains, and then we found that the curb cut, as a result of the curb cuts being inadequate, we couldn't travel safely on the footpath from our home to the village. And so we wrote to the council, and they said that they were scheduled to be repaired in about 3 years. But under a National Disability Insurance Scheme, what we would be able to do would be to contact our local area coordinator. And our local area coordinator would then have the opportunity to, because they would have a more extensive knowledge and evidence base of the people who would benefit from that, to then negotiate with council and to then help us achieve the very first point of the National Disability Strategy, which is ensuring that we have inclusive and accessible communities. So we've got an opportunity to achieve leverage through using the improved processes that we will have from a National Disability Insurance Scheme. And if you can't get to the village, well, as Mark said, you know, you sure as hell won't be able to get on the bus. I must say a shameful wake-up call for me was a couple of weeks ago when I attended the National People with Disability and Carer Council meetings. You might be surprised to know, and please write to your state member, that in Australia, as yet, we cannot get the states to agree to have school buses wheelchair accessible by 2044. Now, how long does a bus last? Help me out here. You know, what's the life expectancy of a bus? 32 years? What's going on? So what we have to do is we need to leverage from one area to another, and to use the public outcry in support of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, not to just focus on that scheme, but to achieve the 6 life areas that are outlined in our National Disability Strategy. And learning and skills, for example, as Mark said, we have far less people who have disability finishing at year 12. When people go on to VET system, they have a lower completion rate. And then once again, only 4% of people accessing disability accessing university are people with disability. So in the US, 11% of tertiary students have some kind of disability, but for us it's just 4. So we do need to get people better educated and better skilled. If we keep on that learning and skills area, one thing I have learned as an employer myself for 20 years is that employers recruit for skills. And if you've got really fantastic skills that are highly sought after in the market, many employers will see it irrelevant whether you have some kind of disability. I mean, one of our, we do run an internship program, and one of our students had a Masters of Quantitative Finance, you know, with like a distinction average. Now, I am sure that that guy will have no difficulty getting a job because he's acquired the skills that employers are really sought after in our economy. But look, I have actually run out of time, but I want to just leave you with some thoughts that I think if we carry these things, we can help people in a whole range of situations. And in working with lots of businesses, these are the kind of things I ask them to do. One is to really think about these principles. The first one is to never assume anything about anyone. So if we just imagine that everyone we meet has some kind of disability, and then as a result of that, if we just imagine that everyone had some kind of disability, what would we do? We'd ask them how we could best work with them, or how we could best support them, or did they need anything from us? What would be useful? So if we just work with everyone that we worked with or that we spent time with, asked, how can I be helpful to you? Then we're really focusing on the fact that we actually don't know people's stories. Best not to make any assumptions. Always focus on asking the person what's going to be useful. So asking the person is the second principle. And the third principle is to remember that people's disability is as individual as their own thumbprint. That just because we know somebody who's had that kind of disability before or another kind of disability, it's really about the person. It's not about the disability. This morning I spoke to a conference in Melbourne, and I asked them what they wanted, a group of employers, and I asked them what they wanted to achieve out of the session, the time we had together. And many of them said they wanted to understand disability better. And at the end of the session, I pointed out that even though I've been working with and very involved in this space for over 20 years, what I've come to realise is how little I know. And in fact, the minute that we assume that we know anything, we've probably headed down the wrong path. So it's best to not know about disability, but know the people that are around us and seek to understand them and to notice how we can support people and to really promote the message of empowerment and ensuring that we give everybody a fair go whilst respecting their own rights to achieve their own journey. Thank you.
It's always inspiring to hear good speakers talk about the topics in clear, logical ways and give you ideas about what you can do in your own work. And it really stretches your thinking quite a lot about new areas of work and life.
So I find this series very, very interesting and very educational. Disability is something I don't know enough about, as most of us don't, and I realise I know even less than I thought I did when I start looking at the statistics and the figures and the issues. So what I've taken away tonight is a lot more knowledge than I had before I walked in the door.